Okay, so let's crack on by making the main bulk of the outside of the sign design. So I'm going to need quite a large sheet for this one. It's going to be 15 inches across and 20 inches high. I've given the thickness of 1 inch, but really that doesn't matter. This is entirely a sign about V-carving, so in fact the thickness of the material is not going to be too important for us. I've set the datum again to be the centre, just because from a drawing point of view this makes symmetrical shapes much easier to work with, and we can always change that later if we need to machine it with a different machining origin. Okay, so let's get cracking. I'm going to start by laying out the figure of 8. So the figure of 8 is made with a larger top circle, which I think is, we're going to have a look here, to be about 13, and I'm just going to use the indication there as I'm drawing the circle. You can also use the shortcut keys and have a look at some of the other techniques for drawing precisely and rapidly to fix sizes. The other interior shape is going to be 8 inches, and I'm going to use this circle twice. If I drag the top node down here and snap it to the bottom node and hold down the control key, I'll make a copy of that circle, and that makes the beginnings of our figure of 8 shape. And now to make the borders of these basic shapes, I'm going to offset everything out by ½ inch. So I set outwards a ½ inch offset. Obviously sharp corners isn't relevant here, so I offset these circles in. This one as well, we'll set that one out as well. Okay, so that's the basis of our shape. Now that we've got the full extent of it, I'm just going to select everything and press F9, which will centre it neatly in my design area here. Now we want to drop a central panel across the middle to contain the text, the main sign, the shop name text here. And I don't quite know what the aspect ratio of that needs to be at this point, so I'm going to drop the text in rather early so that we can get a feel for how that part of the sign should look. Obviously I'm going to modify the text, so this is really just looking at the aspect ratio of the rectangle, you know, how wide and long the rectangle should be to fit this text nicely. So at this point I'm just going to drop the text roughly where I want it to be, which is kind of centered on the intersection here. So that's where it's going to be, and then if I start to draw a rectangle just broadly here, I can see roughly where we want to be. We want to leave a reasonable amount of room here. So I think it's going to be about there. Looking across, I can see that we're nearly 12.5 and around about 2.5. So that's good. I'm going to use those values so that the thing neatens up, and we're using sort of whole numbers, as it were. Then I'm going to F9 to make sure we're centered, and then just use the arrow keys to make sure that it's centrally aligned as I roll it down here. And that looks like that's going to be quite a good aspect ratio. I forgot to mention actually as I went in that I'd also got radius external switched on here, just 1/8 of an inch. So you can see we've got a slight radius. I've used a little small radius because we're going to offset this one out, and as we do, that radius will get larger. So I'm allowing for the fact that, just as with the edges here, as I offset this out by ½ inch to get my border, that radius will get bigger. Okay, so I don't want it to be too big to start with. Okay, so really that's the beginnings of the sign laid out. I'm going to take the text out of the way for now, so we'll move that to a new layer, which we'll call text. And as we create it, we'll also make it invisible so it'll disappear, but we still have it for later. And now I'm going to sort of start offsetting these elements to make the piping, if you like, that we're going to carve. And that's an important part of this process. And that piping, what we're doing is we're going to make it sort of wider on the edges here and here and here. Sorry, this one. But, oops, I've made that one. We have to go the other way for the inner, so outwards. And then for these ones, we're going to go outwards again, but this time by a smaller amount. Just 0.1 this time, and this time we have to go the opposite way, of course. And it starts to get a bit complicated to look at, but actually it shouldn't be too bad. So now we've got the basics of the elements of our design. What we want to do now really is trim this all down so that this makes a single coherent border. I want to keep the middle panel quite tight, so I'm going to start actually just by clipping out the bits here to keep the middle panel correct. Okay, and this is where the scissors come in. If you try to do this, I mean, we've been and will do a lot with the weld tools and the trimming tool, But this is the extra trimming option you have, which is the interactive trim. And this is so useful for situations like this, where you kind of have to get your head around quite a bit of thinking as to what it is you're trying to do. So I'm just going to trim the middle lines here so that I'm maintaining the run through this bit of the sign. And you'll see why in a second. If I just trim the edge bits like this, I'm already beginning to see the wood for the trees a bit now, so I can get my head around exactly what I want to achieve, which is that this pipe work is going to run around the edges of the main shape here. So just click that one, that one, that one, that one. So it's a little bit laborious, but hopefully you get the idea. Keep going along here. That. Same with these. Okay. Okay, so we can run around all these bits. So that's looking okay, because now we can delete some of the bits we don't want. So I'm just going to drag select, and if I drag the box over these areas from left to right, I can get rid of those middle areas. It's a little bit easier than doing the trim. Okay, and that one there, we get rid of that one. Okay, and we can also get rid of all of these. So I can't box select these easily, but if I drag the other way, rather than having to contain everything in the box, it'll select everything that touches the box, which is also a useful tip. So drag from left to right, you have to contain the shapes you're selecting, and right to left allows you to drag the ones that are left there. So we can probably get rid of all these as well. We haven't touched those. Okay, so now we're starting to see a bit more how the sign will look, and I want to now connect up the edge and the middle bits of this work so that we can end up with a neater sign. So back to the trimming tool, not this, sorry, the interactive trim tool, and we just clip these bits now to make the carving complete. Okay, and that really is the basic outline that we need for our sign design. Okay, now we have the border complete. Let's come back and take a look at the text. So I'm just going to switch off the border and bring the text back to take a look at that. Okay, so the text at the moment is in a font form, so we've just created it, and if we click this we can see that we still have it as a font. But from now on I want to really start to treat it as straightforward artwork. So the first thing I'm going to do is to right click the elements of text and convert them to normal curves. So now in essence they have become absolutely normal vectors, and we've lost their fontiness, which is okay in this particular example because we just really want to use them decoratively. So I'm just going to tidy up a bit of the kerning. That's the first thing that's always good to improve the basic look of text, is to make sure it looks balanced and kerned, so that's great. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just select these things and just check to see if there's any poor quality vectors that have emerged from that font. Notoriously, true type fonts are made from a very variable set of sources, usually not very high quality sort of CAD geometry, and they often contain weird or spurious bits of geometry, which cause us problems later on with things like offsetting and VCarving. So before I go any further, I'm going to use our vector validator to see if there's any problems in this. So I'll search that, and I can see we've got 13 zero length spans here. So what that means is these are situations where effectively two nodes are absolutely lying over top of one another, and so the span between them would be 0 in length, and that's likely to cause us some mathematics problems later on. So luckily that's an easy one to fix. Sometimes there's more difficult things. Intersections and overlaps might require you to get in there and decide how you want them to be fixed, but that one's uncontroversial. The other thing we're going to do is drop a little star in here to be the centre of the text. So we'll just make that about ½ inch. Take a look at that. Actually, I've done quite a good job. Drop that in about right. So that's my main logo. I'm going to group that now, and we're going to look at offsetting this to create our drop shadow effect. Before I offset outwards though, I'm going to offset inwards a little bit to make the line that we're going to use as our V-carving pair. So that only needs to be just a little bit in from the edge. So I'm going to offset it inwards by just 0.06 of an inch there, create sharp offsets and offset it in. Now you can see it's dotted at the moment. I'd like to group that because they're a set of vectors. That's actually a little bit awkward because if I press G on the keyboard to group this, it's actually focused at the moment still on this form. But if you use your middle mouse button or scroll round, then effectively you pass the focus back to that view, and when I press G now, that will group. So that's just a little tip. If you end up with that trouble as you're offsetting and you want to group the results, it's handy to be able to do that. Okay, so going back, I can now select the outer set again, and this time we're going to offset out. I'm going to offset out by 0.1, and that gives me one of my edges. And again, we've got the same issue with grouping, so I'll just move it slightly and then group the result and close that down. And now we've got everything nicely grouped so we can select it easily later on. Now the drop shadow effect is really simple. Having made that inner, we've got a pair of lines that we can carve between now, and that will effectively leave this bit as the raised, untouched area as we carve this, and everything else will be dark. So we'll have dark text with a bright white border, and then we're going to have black drop shadow. To make the drop shadow, I just pick up that outer boundary and I'm going to drag it slightly off to the bottom, downwards slightly and to the left, as if we had the light shining from the top right corner. And I press Control as I release, and that makes a copy. So now I have these two lines. They don't need to be miles off, and you can use the keyboard if you like to fine tune it. Once you're happy that you've done a small offset down and right, select the original one. So now I have the original outline and the new copy, and I'm going to use this weld to weld the two together, and that produces the effect of a shadow down below the main text. Okay, so next thing really is to see if that carves okay, and it fits in our design. So I'm going to bring back the original design, and now we can see, because we've slightly moved effectively the weight of the font, we want to come back in and just bring this back just by eye into a position which we're happy with. And that's the beginnings of our sign now, with the Coffee Time logo. Let's take a look at how that carves. I'm just going to select everything, Control A, open up the toolpath tab, spin it out for now, use V-carving. Don't worry about the start depth, we're just going to let it carve in there. I don't think we've got any really big areas. I'm using a 90-degree V-bit, which shouldn't need a clearance tool, that's just left over from a previous calculation. And let's take a look. Now what I'm doing here is I'm using a light beach, and I'm going to fill the toolpath with a colour so that we can see the carving more clearly. Okay, and hopefully you can see that really makes the text pop. If we just carve the text straight off the font, it wouldn't have half the impact that it currently has. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Pleased with that. So for the next step, we're going to come back and we're going to look at how we might put some of the text that's around the top of this part of the sign. Right, let's take a look at how we can add the little bit of text that's going to sit at the top here. Now, what I want to do there is fit it inside an area so that we can cut it negatively. So we want to use the font, but I'm going to cut everything and leave the font upstanding in an area. So the starting point for us is, let's drop in another couple of circles which we're going to use to make the region inside which the text is going to sit. So notice that I can find the center point of our existing circle still, because they're all arcs, and I've got the geometry snapping on. So as I move down here, we can find that center point and it turns to the snapping point for me. So I can drag out another circle at 10 and another one at 12, just to give us two new circles to work with, and we're going to use these as the boundary for our text. Okay, so let's drop the text in. I want to show you a much more dynamic way of working with text. I want to show you that in the latest version of software, it's really good to do things by eye, and much easier than it was before, where you had to really try fiddling with numbers. So I'm going to start with just selecting our font. I'm going to use a normal Arial font this time. I'm going to create it at 1 inch roughly. I mean, there's basically an inch gap here, so let's start with an inch. It's a reasonable guess, and I'm going to put in the the founding date of our coffee shop. So since 1972. Close it down, and let's keep this one as text. So unlike coffee time, I'm going to use all the text tools to make this work for us, but dynamically. Okay, so as I take it up and compare it to my line, you can see obviously we do have it's about an inch high, which is what we'd expect. That inch is not absolutely bang on because it rather depends on the character. So let's just use our normal dynamic scaling tools here, and I'm going to hold down the shift key to do this and get a feel for a size that seems about right, that's going to fit into that space and look okay. So perhaps even a little bit smaller than that. Again, just a little bit. So that seems okay. Now I want to wrap this text around the curve. Okay, so a lot of people will probably leap straight away to this text on a curve. Clues in the name, right? And this is a really powerful tool. This will allow you to drop your text onto any arbitrary curve, whether that's a pure arc or a pure circle or indeed anything else. And that's okay. It's a powerful tool, and as a result it has a lot of options. So I want to show you the sort of often forgotten alternative to that, which is to edit the spacing and at the same time drop a pure arc in. And because we're working with circles here, this actually is going to be quite a powerful approach for us. When I select that, I get some extra options on my text, including this option just to straight away put it onto an arc. And as I do, I get to see the arc, or at least some snap points relating to the arc that we're using. Now you can grab these snap points, in particular this center point, and find the center of the arcs that we're using in our design absolutely precisely, as you can see here. Now we can use this command to dynamically find the center rather than trying to put in value offsets, etc. And if we want to sort out the location of our text, we can simply dynamically drag it around here so that you get the layout that you're after. While you're in this, you also get my favorite thing, kerning, which you're probably hearing a lot about in this demo, to sort of automatically, or at least very simply, get in and fix the balance of that text. And so here we can really interactively get a feel for how that text should look. And when we're happy with it, got the T up there, so I press escape to get out of the text selection mode, and you can see that's a really, really easy way to get in and manipulate text. And because it's still a text object, all of your normal text tools apply. You can modify that text subsequently, you can come back in and change any of the settings. So nothing's lost. It's a really powerful way of dealing with text on pure arcs or pure circles. Okay, so that's that bit of text done. I'm going to just drop in a couple of decorative elements as well. So we're going to draw another couple of stars, slightly bigger this time. So I've made them 0.75 of an inch, about there. Let's get it so it's sort of aligned a little bit neatly. So that looks about right. And I'm going to press Control and H, which copies it automatically across the other side because we've set our origin here to be in the middle. And what I'm going to do is use the tools here to clip back our shapes just like we did before, but I'm going to clip them against an offset of each of these stars, and those offsets will make out by 0.2 of an inch. So we want to get out of the stars by 0.2, and that will give us a boundary to crop against. And while we're at it, we're going to need to crop back here 0.2 of an inch as well. So to do that, an even simpler way of doing that is to start by drawing a rectangle, and I can draw it dynamically here to be 0.2, as you can see. And then when we've got it, just move it across and then make a copy, Control Shift H, and it now appears here too. And this means that we can do this. So we can say take this shape and this shape, and we're going to subtract this shape. And then we can take this shape and subtract this shape. So again, this shape, subtract this shape, and then this shape, subtract this shape. And you can see, because we've made the rectangle be quite big, it's effectively cropped the other shape away as well. So this gives us a sort of bit of interest to work with in here. I want to also offset in these shapes. I'm going to select all these shapes now, including the text, and let's offset the whole lot inwards again by 0.2. And that gives us some boundaries to work with. I'm going to get rid of the junk that's up here, but the rest of it we're going to carve as is. And while we're at it, at this point, I think we're just going to expand the drop shadow text a bit so that it's getting a bit bolder. And again, I hold down the shift key as I do this, and it allows me to expand it from the center out. And make sure that's still centered. Okay, so back to our toolpath. If I select the same toolpath again and just reselect everything, we can calculate that, reset our preview, and take a look at the borderline areas, the borders. Okay, so that's looking quite bold, I think. So we've used that same text, it's now on a curve, it was easy to do, and we've highlighted it effectively by making it onto a sort of negative background with the V-bit tool. Okay, so all it leaves us to do now is to add our main motifs, top and bottom, which is the next part of the demo. Okay, so before we go on to do the main motifs though, I want to talk a little bit about the clip art tab. So if we open the clip art tab that you should have installed, depending on which version of software you'll have different sorts of clip art. A lot of it is a mixture of this 3D stuff, which everyone kind of thinks of really clearly as clip art. But there's also now a lot of options for you to use 2D drawings as well. So we've included in version 10 things like useful profiles. And I think it's worth highlighting that there's nothing magic about these, okay? So if we have a look at the bottle, for example, it's a CRV file. It's a standard VCarve file just saved in a location that gets added to your clip art library. So what I've done here is I've added my own folder. You can just simply add a folder anywhere you like on disk. I keep a folder which I've put on Dropbox, which makes it easy for me to synchronize it across different machines. And if I open VBit carvings, you can see here that I've got some files that are simply the CRV files that I've made before. And that's where I'm going to go and show you how I made the coffee cup and the Full of Beans logo. And the reason for doing this is because these have become your own library of reusable parts. And so the coffee cup logo might be the sort of thing that you're either going to use on other signs generally, but also perhaps this is part of a project for a company who want more than one sort of part. They want a sign, they want some engravings in a table or a screen for their serving area, or perhaps they want table mats, you name it. So keeping the bits of their artwork handily grouped and reusable is, I think, an important thing to consider. So I'm going to create them in this way, and we'll come back once I've created those and use them from this file. Okay, so let's take a look at how that coffee cup was built using some very simple vectors. So I'm going to do this in an entirely separate file so that I can keep the piece of artwork later on. So I'm going to show you how you might want to add little iconic drawings that you do to a library so that you can reuse them later on. So to do this, I'm going to create a completely new file. It's fairly arbitrary what the size is, but I find that if you're going to build a library of artwork, often it's quite useful to be fairly consistent once you start in building that artwork at the same scale, just because it's easier later on when you're doing assembly to bring things in if they're broadly the same size, so that they're not huge in one particular design and tiny in another. So I'm going to make everything in a 6-inch square for my library. So I'll start with 6 inches by 6 inches and just a 1/4 inch thick. This is just a drawing, so the thickness really isn't important. What is important often when you're doing a design is to put the datum in the middle. Just from a drawing point of view, it's often much more helpful to have your origin in the center than anywhere else, although obviously when you're machining that can change. So here's my design. I'm going to start to make just so remember this coffee cup is made up of just highlights really. And so my starting point is just to drop in a circle that's roughly going to be the size of the cup itself. So around about this size. And then what I do is I'm just going to drag a copy. So what I'm doing is dragging this, but I'm holding down the control key, which turns it into a drag copy operation. And what I'm after is the crescent moon at the bottom, which is going to form the highlight of the shadow of the cup. So I just drag it up like that. Now I'm going to select the first one, hold down the shift key and select the second one so that they're both highlighted. And over here we have our various welding tools, which are going to be the key to this demonstration. And I'm going to use the subtract, which subtracts the second selected vector from the first. So if we click that, we'll see that we get the crescent moon. Remember, if you get the other way round, if you were to get the other half of your design, that probably means you just need to reselect the vectors in the other order. So it's the first vector and then it subtracts the second thing you select from that one. Okay, and it's described there on the tooltip if you need to remind yourself. Okay, so that's the sort of basics of the cup. Let's drop in now an oval which is going to represent the coffee in the middle. So I'm going to use the ellipse for this, and the ellipse grows from the center. So I start by finding the point roughly where that cup is going to be, and then we just got to get the sort of tilt of the cup roughly right and drop that in there. And then again, I'm going to create the shadow effect by dragging a copy of this first one over and up to the right here. And then what I'll do is I'll just shrink the size of my shape. Now, to shrink the size around the center point, if I just drag this one, you can see it shrinks it from the top right. But if I hold down the shift key, it'll shrink it from the center. So again, that's a nice way of controlling exactly how you want your design to work. So now I'm just going to allow that to clip. Now remember, we subtract the second thing from the first thing. So if I select the first one and then the thing we're going to trim out of it and select that, we get the crescent representing a bit of coffee, well, the edge of the coffee cup in shade. And then what I want to do is put some actual coffee in the middle, and the center of that coffee would be about there. So I drag my oval out to make the coffee itself. Now this time we want to, rather than chop one out, we just want the overall result of both of these shapes. So this is to weld the outline to produce our effect there of the sort of coffee and the shade of the cup. Next thing I'm going to do is produce some hint of the coffee cup handle, and this is really straightforward. I'm just going to drop in a circle like so, round about the size that you expect the handle to be. And again, just as we've done before, I'm going to offset a second copy by holding down the control key as I drag to make our crescent. And then we want this one to have this one taken away from it, like so. And then, of course, I can always just reposition that a little bit here to get my shape correct. Okay, so that's the basics of the cup. So the last bit now is just a hint at the shadow of the saucer underneath. And again, I'm going to use the ellipse. I'm going to find roughly where I think the saucer's middle would be with a bit of perspective. So it's around about there, probably overcook that a little bit. So let's just jog that down. So I'm going to select it. I'm using the arrow keys, which keeps it nicely aligned till I think that's in about the right place. Select it again. And as we're getting familiar now, I'm just going to drag that up and to the right. This time the shadow's on the other side of the saucer. So select the first one and the one we want to take away from it. And we get the hint of a saucer there underneath the cup. Okay, so that's the cup itself, just done, as you say, sort of minimally using shading. What I would like to do now is just add this sort of iconic steam coming from the top. And I'm going to start with just a straight line right down the middle here, like so. Okay, so it's slightly difficult to see actually against the grey of the center line. But as I press N to make it node editable, we can see it more clearly. So now I can see the start point, end point in the span, which is a line. If I roll over that line, I can right click and turn it to a Bezier, which you'll see is the shortcut key B. So another top tip is any of those, you don't need to go to the right click, then you can just use B to make it a Bezier, A for an arc, etc. So now I've got the control points here. Now in the older version of Aspire and VCarve, you had to drag these nodes to make the shape, which is still perfectly okay. But now you can also drag the curve directly, which is a very handy way and more kind of intuitive way of getting the curve that you're after without worrying about the handles. They're set for you once you drag the curve to the right position. Okay, so just sort of stretching that right out. So I've got one half, if you like, of my steam shape. So I'm just going to take that, copy and place a second one over the top, node edit that one. And now we should start to get the second half of our steam shape, as you can see there. So that looks pretty good. Now, at the moment, these are separate lines, because I remember one's just a copy of the other. But if I group select, and if I group select by dragging right to left, it selects everything the box touches, as opposed to everything that's contained in the box. So that's a quick way to select. And then we can just right click this, and I can ask it to join or close the vectors just by moving the endpoints, which we know already are pretty much coincident. So that's my first bit of steam, and I'm going to just sort of pan out a bit now so that I can get a feel for getting that to be the right size. We can afford for it to, it's iconic at the end of the day, so we can afford to it to come into the cup a little bit, I think. Now I can take a copy of that, move it to the side, and another one, and move that to the side here. And we'll just resize those so that they look reasonably consistent. And again, I can group them all now, and let's just get them into a position that we think is just aesthetically pleasing. like so. Okay, so that's my basic iconic coffee cup. Now what I'm going to do is save that in the folder that I've added as my clip art folder, which I happen to keep on Dropbox so that it's available wherever I am. I can keep useful files, so I can do save as, and in my Dropbox bit carvings area I can just save coffee cup. I'm just saving it as a CRV file, as you can see. And when we go back to the other version of the software, we'll be able to see our coffee cup in that clip art folder. And then it will be there from now on, and a reusable piece of artwork as we start to build our library. Okay, as with the coffee cup, we're going to make the inverting beans logo at the bottom of the sign in a separate file to start with, to keep things nice and organized, and also to allow me to reuse it if I wanted to in a different sign or some other part of the same marketing materials that I might be making for that company. So again, I'm going to make it a consistent size. The size is largely arbitrary, but keeping it consistent is useful. So 6 inches square, and again, the width, the thickness of the material is not really important because this is just for drawing and V-bit carving. Centered origin again, and off we go. So the starting point again for this, as with many of the other design elements, is an ellipse. So I just drag out an ellipse shape that's around about the size of the material I've got to work with. But this isn't very coffee bean like, so I'm going to just switch on node editing mode and show you quite quickly that what we really want here is something that looks a bit more organic, not geometric. And coffee beans tend to be sort of more pillow shaped than they are ellipses. So I'm going to start by just making it slightly asymmetric to start with by shifting these endpoints up and down a little bit, which already helps. And then I'm just going to sort of drag out the end areas. So if I grab the curve quite close to these points, I can start to square up the ends quite easily to get ourselves a coffee bean shape. And again, as I drag these around, the whole thing just starts to become a little bit more organic looking. So it doesn't have to be brilliant, perfect. It just has to give that sort of hint of a coffee bean shape. So that's good enough. Then we're going to drop across a curve just to help us at this point. I'm not going to do much with this initially, but it's just to help us get a feel for the layout when we drop the text in. So we're going to put our curve across here like so to give it that sort of feel of the coffee bean, and that's where we're going to split the inverting V carving as well. But for now, we're going to come back and fiddle with that because it'll be an interaction between that and the text once we finish doing it. So this is my basic artwork, at least the framing of it. The next thing is to drop the text in. Okay, so I'm going to just grab the text, and it doesn't really matter where it goes to start with because I'm going to do a lot of fiddling with it. I'm using the same font as the Coffee Time logo, and just trying to keep that as a consistent theme throughout the sign. And this time we just use beans, exclamation mark, and create that. And it's really big text at the moment. But the main thing about it I can see is when I try and distort this inside this shape, I'm going to have a lot of trouble with the fact that there are two distinct heights of letter here. So I'm straight away going to throw away the fontiness of this. So we don't need it to be a font. We just want it to be curves and artwork now. So I convert it to curves straight away. Then I'm going to select this middle text and just start to grow it so that it's kind of getting up to the same size as the exclamation mark and the capital B here, so around about there. Okay, and then we just need to grab the other letters here, which is going to be slightly awkward actually. I've made that difficult for myself, but it's this. Just nudge that across, and so that looks sort of okay, doesn't it? So I'll just budge that in a bit. Now this looks kind of in scale. I think everything's got thinner in the capital letters and the exclamation mark relative to the main text because it's not been scaled as well. So I'm just going to fatten that up a little bit, and the same with the B here, so that they look more, the actual font weight looks more in proportion. But I don't want to spend masses of time on it. So that'll do. I'm going to just grab it all now and group select it so it'll be easier to handle. Drop it roughly centered here and shrink it down so that it's sitting in a way all inside this boundary. Okay, so that's the sort of basics. Remember, it's not text anymore, it's just curves, and we ought to therefore just be able to envelope distort it. And if we have a go at that, we're going to find though that it causes us a problem. And I'm showing you this because this is really common. If you take fonts as the basis of your vector geometry, you're going to find that font artwork in particular is notoriously poorly constructed in terms of the precision and kind of cleanliness of the data. It often has spurious extra elements in it, and in this case that's causing us to fail to be able to do our normal algorithm for distorting. So what do we do about that? Well, if you encounter that, get your objects, your text or your vectors that are failing, ungroup them so we can see all of the basic internal shapes in them, and then go into the vector validator here. And that will allow you to analyze the selected items to see if there's any problems. And straight away we can see that this font has got a lot of coincident nodes, which appear as zero length spans or coincident nodes. It means that you've got 2 points directly over the top of one another with a span between them, which is effectively therefore has no length because the start and end points are in the same location. This causes all sorts of maths problems. So we'll just fix those, close that down and regroup our artwork. Now we should find that we fix that problem. We can go in and start to distort the text as you would first expect it. Okay, so I've dropped this into place to start with. Remember that you can move it around with transforming as well as editing the envelope, but we're going to straight away get into editing the envelope here. The envelope starts as a rectangle with straight lines, but just as with any other node editing operation, you can convert these to whatever span type you like. So in my case, I'm going to hover over that, press B to convert these all to Bezier span types, just as with the ellipse that we're trying to fit to. And then I'm going to roughly take these corners out, leaving some allowance around the edges because we're going to be doing carving around the edges of this text. So let's start with that. Then I'm going to use the dragging of the Bezier curves like so to start to get this text to fit into the boundaries in the same way that we did the ellipse in the first place. And this is really just a sort of artistic operation for you now. You just have to decide how you want to do this until it looks good. And I don't think it needs to be particularly perfect by any means. So that's probably good enough for us. Now I can see the curve that we're going to use to clip the text in situ. I can also start to drag that in a way that now makes it kind of feel good through the text. I'm going to try and avoid double clipping through inside and outside of these shapes if I can. And also we're allowing it to pass through that gap, and that will be a bit neater where the intersection is between the text. We don't want it to be in a sort of part of the text that's significant for a recognition or something. So that feels pretty good to me. I'm going to take that, and this now is my kind of master artwork for the rest of the process. So what I'm going to do at this point is come to this layer and just rename this master artwork, because we're going to reuse many of these items in several different ways to form the top and the bottom. So just to remind you, what we want to end up with here is the bottom part of our beam. We're going to VCarve inside the letters to make those dark, and on the upper side of the beam we're going to VCarve in between the letters so that you get that transition across the split line here. So the first thing we're going to need to do is have two boundaries which each are formed from excuse me, these two lines. So I'm going to start by doing the top half. So I'm going to select this one and this one off our master artwork and copy them to a new layer which we're going to call top. Okay. And similarly, I'm going to take this one and this one again, and I'm going to copy them to the new layer called bottom. And that's going to start us off. And then up here, we can come back in, we can turn off the master artwork and the bottom layer, just look at the top layer. It was in red here. If you select a layer which is not visible, it warns you that you're not going to be drawing on a layer that you can see. So that's generally a bad idea. So if it's in red, that means you're probably looking at the wrong layer. So in our case, with the visible layer is top, so I select that. And all we need to do now is use the scissor tools just to clip away the excess here. And that's the boundary that we need for the top of the beam. And then we can select the bottom here, make that visible and turn off the top, and do the same for the bottom half. Okay, so now we have really the same shape, but it's formed now with two boundaries which are independent of one another. Okay, so let's go back to the master artwork now and take this text and make a copy of it
to the top. Okay, so let's go back to our top layer here. So now we have the text. Now remember, for this layer, we want to carve between this boundary and this text. So this is really a fairly simple operation. For us, we just need to get hold of the, we need to create a region that is the region except for this text. So that, as we've seen already before, is fairly straightforward. I need to convert the text to curves and group it. And then if you remember, we choose the object and the second object we want to remove from it, and we can use the subtract tool here. And that will give us this region to carve between. Okay, so that's the top half done. The bottom half is slightly more complicated, which we need to move get some text on it first. So let's do the same again. So this time I select the text from my master artwork and copy a version of that to the bottom that we can use for clipping. And then select the bottom again. Okay, so same again. The first thing I need to do is convert the text, the distorted object, to curve so that we can edit it, and press G to group it. Now this time we've got to do something slightly different. We want to carve inside the text, but also we would like to have a boundary here that we can also carve between so that you keep the line of the beam carved. So the first thing I'm going to do in this case is offset that in just a little bit by 0.1 so that we get a nice boundary inside that we can carve as well. And now what we want is actually the same sort of operation but against this inner boundary so that we keep the outer one, so that we're VCarving, remember, the inverse of the resulting shapes. So in this case, I'd select the text that I am going to clip and the object we're subtracting it from. Oops, done it the wrong way around, haven't I? Sorry. It's the shape that we want and the object we're subtracting it from. And we get now a similar boundary, but this time we're going to select this one, and the area between them will be the V-carved shape. Okay, so that's really all there is to it, to making that artwork. If I bring them both back on now, we can actually just check that this all works. Now, when I bring them back together, you'll see that one of the issues we've got here is there's some very coincident looking lines here. If we try and V-carve this all as one go, the VCarve algorithm may struggle with some of these intersections. So you might need to do two V-carvings independently, but we'll give it a go and see how it gets on. So we select everything, toolpaths, V-carving, and I'm just going to use the default 90-degree V-bit tool. It thinks we've got some stuff. Let's have a look, see what happens. So actually it's come out not too bad actually. So if I just carve that now, we can see the end result. So it's carving at this point the text and the little boundary we made, and now it's carving everything between the text and the original boundary. And we get our two-tone text effect. Okay, so that's the beans two-tone effect. We're going to go on now to add the small bit of handwriting, the sort of signature at the top as the next part of the demo. So back to the 2D view now with the original artwork for the beans that we've just created, and I'm just going to nudge that down because we're going to add at the top here a little bit of handwritten or apparently handwritten hand-carved text to say full of. So I'm going to go back to text tool straight away, and I'm going to use one of the script fonts. Okay, so these are the fonts that are designed to look like they join up. So I'm going to use Sago script, and I'm going to type in full of. Okay, again, we're not too worried about the size at this stage because I'm going to fiddle a lot with this to get it to look right. Okay, so let's take a look first at what we get straight out of the box with one of these fonts. What you get is the attempt of the font is to be kerned so they overlap, such that if they were printed, they would look like they were joined up handwriting. And these are fairly crudely done, but they give you a reasonable starting point. So the first thing I think is to say is that if you use this straight out of the box like this, it quickly looks obvious that it's not exactly what it is really, which is a straightforward font. People recognize it really easily. So we want to do a few little tweaks that are not too intense, but they are going to make the font feel a lot more bespoke and custom for very little effort. So my starting point, as usual, I'm going to scale it down a little bit and try and get the layout correct. The first thing we want to do is weld this text so that we get rid of the overlaps, because we know we can't carve those easily. And I want to show you an important issue here, which is much better in version 10 of the software, but if you're using version 9 or earlier, you'll have to think about. If you simply convert this to curves first and then weld it, okay, it does the correct operation, which is it welds and finds the external boundaries. But because it doesn't know it's text, it loses the centers of lots of your letters. So in this case, we've lost the O. That's kind of mathematically correct, but because it's text, we sort of know intuitively that it shouldn't do that. So while it's in text mode, we can actually allow the software to be a bit cleverer as well, and it can correct that. So if we use the weld tool when it's in text mode, it'll ask us whether we're going to do the conversion, etc. And we're going to replace our font with the curves. But because it was text to start with, now it knows to behave slightly differently and keep the centers of text. So that's a convenient way. Make sure if you're going to weld text, you do it when it's in as a font, as part of the conversion process rather than afterwards. Okay, so let's do a few things now that will immediately make this look a bit better. The first thing is I'm going to just tilt the whole thing onto an angle. When you're handwriting things, you tend to write slightly. If you're right-handed, you'll write slightly at an angle. So the first thing we'll do is that. This allows us as well to sort of drop the text in a little bit more conveniently. You can see here that the F now could be a little bit fuller, if you'll excuse that expression. Generally speaking, people sort of, their capital or their first letter is a bit bigger. Now, if I was just to scale this up, then we would just end up with a heavier font, which we don't really want. We just want it to be a little bit taller. And with a capital F, that's quite easily done. As with all the fonts, when I look at the actual vector artwork, it's horrific usually. So the first thing I do with all of these things before I go any further is fit them. So in fact, we can just fit all of these because we're going to want them to be simpler to start with. So I'm using now the curve fitting. That finds all the points currently in there, of which there's a bazillion. We're going to say, let's replace those with some Bezier curves. We use a reasonable tolerance here and have a look how much. So you can see here, we can dramatically reduce now the number of curves that we've got to fiddle with, but still pretty much all of the shape is fine. So the reason I do this is because as you start to edit text, the basic rule is the fewer nodes you have, the more straightforward the process is. So now I can see that I've got down here, basically the end of this text. I can grab, remember, I can group select nodes just like I can group select anything else. And so I can just grab those nodes and stretch that F so that it gets a bit bigger, but it doesn't get any fatter. And now we can see that we're starting to get to a situation where this looks a little bit more like somebody might have handwritten that F. Similarly, over here, these L's are obviously the same font letter, and typically they look too symmetrical. So the other thing we can do at this point is just make this a little bit more like it's a sweep of the pen finishing. You can see here this node is blue. That means it's being smoothed. And if I move one control point, the other control point moves with it. That essentially blunts the curve. If I roll over it and switch that smoothness off with S, it'll go black. And that kind of means now these points can be moved independently. And it means we can sort of sharpen up the shape a little bit like it's being swept away with the pen at the end of that, which again is a more natural way that people work. Over here, we've got some oddities because really they've tried to make the fonts join up, but they don't really know about each other very much. So in this case, the O's trail doesn't really connect very neatly with the F. I think if I was to do the handwriting here, this O would actually sweep right up to the F. Then I'd probably come down and put the curve in here. So I'm going to actually mod that. We've got this weird lump here which doesn't serve any purpose, so we can just get rid of that. If I just roll over the node and delete it, I can get rid of that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in my own curves here that we'll use to weld back against the text. This part of the F I want to come from the tail here. So another useful thing that you can do is if you group select sections like this of your nodes, you can use the keys to actually move whole design elements around like this, which is quite neat. Not everyone knows that you can do that. Got to be careful here actually that I don't do that, though, because that will upset our carving later on, so don't put any loops or whatever in. Okay, so this is better now, and I can now just draw very roughly a shape which is going to go from here, it's going to loop around here and kind of join up initially I'm going to do this absolutely crudely out of just squares. And then I'm going to node select all of these, and I'm going to roll over them in one go and press smooth. And you can see straight away that I can start to fix now the curves up more easily. And we can, I've not managed to join those up, let's join that up. Close it, removing the endpoints. Okay, so it doesn't have to be terribly brilliant, this, but just so it looks like it could have connected into that. So just roughly get the tangency right there. And then similarly, we can do another one here, which runs as if it's going from there up to there and down here and back there. So something like that. Nasty little extra node I don't want in there. Let's delete that. Okay, and again, I can just smooth that and make that a Bezier curve there, and then we just drag them into roughly the right locations, like so. And they look horrible at the moment, but as soon as I select them and we just weld them all together, okay, we get something. Oops, don't want that to be welded. That looks pretty good. We've got some wobbles here, but again, we can just come back in and fix those. That just needs to be smoothed, and probably that too. Okay, and now we've got something that looks much more like it's handwritten text, and that's what we're going to use for the basis of our V-bit carving. So some minor edits to an existing font, and the thing starts to look a lot more bespoke, and also just a lot more realistic. Okay, so that's the lower part of the element, which we'll now bring back into our main sign design.
Right, so now we can drag in our pieces of artwork. So we've designed the coffee cup, so I just literally pick it up now from this folder. That CRV file we made earlier, it automatically brings in the vectors associated with the file. It brings them in as well with the layers that you built. So it's a really handy way of keeping your 2D artwork stored, because we can keep a lot of the information associated with it as well. So I'm just going to set the size. Remember, we built everything to be 6 inches by 6 inches, and so that's how it'll come in initially, but we can resize it according to our design. And the fuller beans, similar idea. Let's drop that in the bottom here. This one tells us we're importing an invisible layer. That's because I had the original text, if you remember, hidden. Do we want to show them? No, not really, but they are there in case you need them. So again, it's a really useful way of storing your artwork so that you don't lose anything. Okay, so I just line all that up. It's going to complain, remember, when we do the VCarve on this, it's going to be a bit concerned that there's some overlapping vectors which it may or may not get right. So it will warn us that it might not get everything right. But in this case, I'll give it a go, and I know where the problem will be, and we'll come back. If it did cause trouble, the solution would simply be to VCarve the bits independently. So we'd VCarve the top section first, okay, and then come back and VCarve the second section. And that way there would be no single VCarving where these overlaps would be occurring. But let's keep our fingers crossed, bring out the VCarving here. I'm just going to simply select all. Now, because I've got some areas that are a bit larger now, I am going to bring in a clearance tool. So I'm going to select a small clearance tool of 1/8 N mil, and that will be used if there's any areas that we feel like we need to use the tool for, so that we don't go deeper than, say, 0.2 of an inch. Let's try that. So here's my warning. Whoops, there's some overlapping vectors. That's down here. We'll risk it, see what happens, and actually it looks like it's going to be okay. So let's now reset our preview and preview all the toolpaths. Okay, and here you can see our finished sign. We can see now where we've come in and done a little bit of work here, which was going deeper than 0.2. So we've got a little bit here with the end mill. So that saves a bit of time. Of course, you have to exchange that for using a tool change. And then the finale then, let's just for the purposes of rendering really, I'm going to go back in to do a profiling toolpath on this extra edge. So we're going to profile around the edge. I'm going to set the Z to be, sorry, the depth to just be Z. So remember, you can use these fixed commands that will work out what the depth is, and we just want to make sure we're on the outside. Calculate that, and if I preview that, as it cuts through, it'll allow us to remove the waste material, and that gives us our finished sign design.